solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
I'm sorry?
I said, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank you.
And I guess you were just sworn back in, but you've testified here before the jury before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me focus you after you had a conversation where you took an initial statement from Mr. Zimmerman. We talked about that in your initial testimony, correct?
We did.
And then you were also present with Chief Investigator Serino when he was doing some of his workup, including a second statement taken from my client. Remember that?
Yes, I remember. I was there.
Okay. Was there a time that you were present where Investigator Serino was meeting with Tracy Martin?
Yes, I was there when he was meeting with Tracy Martin.
If you would, tell the jury the circumstances surrounding that.
Senator, I'm going to object. This calls for hearsay, and we can approach the bench for voting.
Yes, you may approach.
We were at the point, I think, where you were telling us about an event with Officer Serino and Tracy Martin. Remember that?
Yes, I do remember that.
Okay. I think the last question was, can you tell us sort of the setting, sort of give us an outlay of how things were when you were there?
Okay, I believe it was 2 days after the incident that Trayvon was shot, and Tracy Martin was there to speak to Chris Serino, and he was concerned that arrest hadn't been made, and Chris Serino was trying to explain to him the circumstances of the way.
Your Honor, I would not be offering Officer Serino's statements as, for the truth of the matter, sort of rather laying out the foundation. I think that's an exception to the hearsay rule. I'm not going to get into what I'm speaking, and I apologize.
Okay. She could testify as to what she has observed and what the circumstances were, but not as to what anybody said.
You report,
Not as to what anybody said?
including the other officer? Because if then I would need to be heard at the bench for that, Your Honor. I know the limitation we talked about already, just not that one.
Well, go ahead and ask your question, I'll wait for an objection.
Okay, thank you. I think you were saying then sort of the setting, so if you would continue.
Okay, the setting was in the office cubicles at one, and it was sitting, they were both sitting at Chris Sereno's desk. Chris in his own seat, in an extra chair that had brought over to Chris's desk so that Tracy Martin could sit. I believe it was his girlfriend that was with him. And they were there so that Chris Sereno could explain to them why, at this point, an arrest couldn't be made.
And it was your understanding that Investigator Sereno was still in the beginning stages of the investigation, is that correct?
Yes, I believe it was either 2 or 3 days after the incident.
And where were you sitting or standing while this conversation was occurring?
I was sitting probably diagonal to the cubicles. The cubicles are set in a square, and there's a path between them that you can walk through, and then there's a hall. And I was basically in the hall. It's not really a hall, but it's where the cubicles would end before there's another wall that actually has offices that are walled. So I was probably about 8 or 10 feet from his desk.
Okay. And did there come a time then that Investigator Sereno played what we now know to be the Lauer 911 call for Mr. Tracy Martin and his girlfriend to listen to?
Yes, he played it for them.
And do you recall if it was played once or more than once?
I recall it was played once. I'm not sure if it was played more than that.
And without telling us the verbal response, what did Mr. Martin do in response to listening to the call?
Stand objection, Your Honor. Calls for
Well,
hearsay.
she could describe what she saw, but not what she heard.
You understand hearsay, right? And what you can and can't say. So I'm not asking you to tell us what Mr. Martin said, but I am asking you to give an observation as to his physical response.
He was very upset. He was very sad. He hung his head. He cried.
And did he give a response to Officer Sereno?
Yes.
The next question I think might be objectionable for record purposes, Your Honor. What did Mr. Martin say in response to the question by Mr. Sereno as to whether or not that was his son's voice?
Stand objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And no further questions for this witness right now, Your Honor, though. Statement has.
No questions?
Okay, thank you. May Officer Singleton be excused? May Officer Singleton be excused?
I would need her to be recalled potentially as we go through the next couple
Okay.
of witnesses.
You're subject to being recalled, so please stay in the building. You're excused from the courtroom. Call your next witness, please.
We'll call Chris Sereno, Your Honor. Officer Chris Sereno. And again, just tell us about how far away you were from that event.
Closer than I am to his desk right now.
I think you said on 8 or 10 feet.
I believe it's 8 or 10
Let
feet.
me, if I might approach the witness, just to ask her to stop me at about the distance.
Right about right there.
Okay, so you're sitting there, and then
That's-
Officer Sereno's desk would be about here?
That's where they're sitting, yes.
Okay. You weren't actually part of the conversation, though, were you?
No.
You sort of observing it from afar, or from 10 feet away?
Yes, I didn't feel like I should be too close to him. He needed his space.
Okay. But you were listening?
Yes.
And do you recall what it was that you heard Officer Sereno ask Mr. Martin after playing the Lauer 911 call?
If he recognized the voice.
Okay. Again, do you have the exact words, or you remember?
I don't know if those were exact words, but that was the question, if he had recognized the voice.
Okay. And Mr. Martin's response?
That it was not his son.
I think earlier you said that he actually put his head down or something.
Yes, and he was crying, and he was sad. He had his head down, and he was wiping his face with tissues. His girlfriend was behind him, trying to comfort him. She was kind of rubbing his shoulder some.
Presuming that was Brandy Green,
I believe that's who it was.
Okay. Did she say anything about whose voice she thought it was on the tape?
I don't recall hearing her say anything.
But again, Mr. Martin's words were?
that was not his son's voice.
Nothing further on.
Okay, Cross?
Good afternoon again, Officer Singleton. You recall actually Tracy Martin saying that was not his voice, that it's not his son's voice?
Yes.
Okay. And you clearly heard him say those words?
I don't know his exact words, but he was telling us that it was not his, or he was telling Chris that it was not his son's voice that was screaming for help.
I mean, he said words, in other words, like you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And then after that, he put his head down, is what you're saying?
I think it was even while listening to it
Okay.
that he was already crying, because you could hear the gunshot.
And so, obviously, you were sensitive of that too, the fact that they were playing this recording to the father of the person that's being shot on the tape, correct?
Yes, I was choked up myself. I had to stand back, and I felt, I could feel how he must feel, because I have children, and I was choked up by it, and I felt horrible for him.
And you could see that and sense that in Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Okay. And now, were you there for the playing of all the recordings, or just part of it?
I don't know if there was more recordings. That really stuck out in my mind, because I remember feeling so awful for him that he would have to hear that.
So as far as you can recall, the only one you recall is the one where they were playing the recording of the screams, but also the shooting of
Yes.
Mr. Martin's son.
Yes, and that's why it stood out in my mind.
And what stood on your mind is the pain that that father must have been going through at the time.
Yes, to know that he was hearing the sound that ended his son's life was tough to watch.
And did he, in your opinion, react as any grieving father would react?
Yes, he was very sad.
Now, he didn't get up and start screaming or anything, correct? He just basically put his head down and just started crying, right?
He was, I could see him wiping tears from his eyes. And, I mean, he didn't lose it. I'm sure he was trying to hold himself together, and he's in the middle of a police department. But you could see that he was upset, of course.
And as you indicated, even while you were doing it, even from a distance away, it was hard for you to listen to that, correct?
Yes, and I had already heard it.
And I think you've already stated you felt awful for him, correct?
I can't imagine having to go through that, because I have children, and I couldn't imagine.
Thank you.
Redirect?
As sad as it was, both for you to listen to and obviously for Mr. Martin to go through, is there any doubt in your mind that he had said that that was not his son's voice that he heard screaming?
No, there's no doubt that he was telling us that didn't sound like his son to him.
Nothing further on.
May Officer Singleton be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Subject to recall.
You're excused, subject to being recalled? Today? No. We'll call you. Thank you. Call your next witness, please.
Defense would call Adam Pollock.
Yes, you may.
Welcome back to our live coverage of.
If you would, tell the jury the circumstances surrounding that.
Senator, I'm going to object this calls for hearsay, and we can approach the bench for the
Yes, you may approach.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
I'm sorry?
I said, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank you.
And I guess you were just sworn back in, but you've testified of his workup, including a second statement taken from my client. Remember that?
Yes, I remember. I was there.
Okay. Was there a time that you were present where Investigator Serino was meeting with Tracy Martin?
Yes, I was there when he was meeting with Tracy Martin.
Here before the jury before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me focus you after you had a conversation where you took an initial statement from Mr. Zimmerman. We talked about that in your initial testimony, correct?
We did.
And then you were also present with Chief Investigator Serino when he was doing some of